Right, well, hello everyone, and thank you for inviting me. My name is John Buchanan. My plan is to spend the next 45 minutes to talk to you about the wildlife to be encountered along our favourite waterway. Right, so firstly, a bit of context. Well, I've lived in Malden and living on the east end of town for 20 years. And Malden is a town that only exists because of the river system. It's all the strategic location at the head of the estuary that's really the cause of Malden being built up. And the canal, which opened in the late 18th century, of course, is the principal trade route that stimulated improved trade through Malden and Heybridge until it finally being superseded by rail and improved road systems. And I'm sure I don't need to talk now because you're all experts on this, is that the route, but the route going through Heybridge rather than through Malden because of arguments going on at the time with the tradespeople. Malden worried that if trade was going through Malden on the canal, it wouldn't stop and they couldn't collect duties, but of course they ended up going via Heybridge, so they missed out anyway. But much of Heybridge was built up as a result of the communities needed to build the canal. So a group of us, about 3 or 4 people of keen naturalists in Malden, have been studying the wildlife in Malden for quite some detail, mainly the last 20 years. In fact, I mean, our area is on the circle, showing the circle on this map, and it's 3 miles from the centre of our patch, and the centre of patch happens to be where Russ, one of our team, was living at the time. It seems a good place as any, and it includes lots of different areas of habitat. But one of the key areas for us is the navigation system because of the special wildlife that's there. Okay, so the stretch of navigation that we've looked at in our study area stretches from the locks at Heybridge all the way up to Ricketts Lock, which is on the edge of our patch. But in fact, by the time you get onto Ricketts Lock, the natural history of the navigation is pretty constant. In fact, pretty much all the way to Chelmsford. I mean, certainly I've been up and down the further bits. I've once ran it. It's a long way. I don't think I'll be doing that again. So I'm familiar with the other reaches, but most of the sort of photographs and talk I'll be giving are kind of up to about this part of the canal. Now, there's basically 2 main habitats that we look at from a nature point of view. There's the water itself, navigation itself, and then there's all the plants and trees that grow along the towpath. And particularly, I mean, the obvious ones along the Chelmer navigation is the willows and osiers and alders and so forth. There's a whole variety, including famously cricket-bat willows for match-winning cricket bats production. Although I said there's 2 habitats, actually they're very much interrelated. So a lot of the plants and so on exist because of the combination. So here we have some of the sort of plants that grow, and these particular ones are sort of classic ones for the canal navigation. This one here, the tall one, is purple loosestrife, which is there for much of the summer. It's probably one of the dominant plants once the sort of the yellow flag iris has drifted off. And then in the foreground, although it's less obvious, is watermint. But it's a very nice plant to have. It's very good for insects and it smells nice. Mint, as you might expect. So to start with, let's look at some of the typical birds to be seen along the navigation. Now, the fact is that you can quite often walk along the canal and see pretty much nothing at all. You can be aware that there's all this wildlife supposed to be there, but on a particular day, it can seem very empty. But very few days at all when you can't see these things is moorhens and coots. The coots on the right with the sort of famous bald as a coot white patch on the forehead. And they are sort of regular residents, very populous. Moorhens have loads of families, often have sort of 2, 3, maybe even 4 broods a year. So I think what that proves is moorhen chicks probably are the premium source of food for things like pike and mink and so on. Otherwise, we wouldn't be able to move for moorhen. Other birds that you would expect to see are mute swans. The reason for putting this particular slide up is that there's a variant of mute swan that you get, particularly in East Anglia, which is a sort of genetic thing called Polish swan. It's sort of recessive gene, and it can it creates pure white cygnets, and the adults look a bit different as well. And it just so happens that around Malden, quite often you'll see a family of swans with one of these white cygnets. So that one, sort of two from the right, is a Polish swan cygnet. The reason they're called Polish is because it's thought that this particular variant was very common amongst the mute swans that were imported into London around about, I think, about the 17th century, 18th century. Spread from there. So that's something to look out for when you're looking at swans, and to amaze your friends with. If you see one, you can tell them the story. Another common bird is a grey heron, often seen particularly in the shallows, particularly when the sort of tributaries, up the side branches, the backwaters of the canal. But, very familiar and often to be heard as well as they croak as they fly over. Along the hedgerows, there's often smaller birds. And these
long-tailed.
Thank you very much. Yeah, and yeah, indeed, long-tailed tits, and the tits are one of the most frequent of the species that we have that live in the bushes either side of the canal, along with sort of wrens and robins and thrushes and blackbirds and so on. The most commonly seen bird of prey is this one, the kestrel. And particularly with sort of meadow areas, in particular meadow areas, say just before Langford, there's pairs that breed there, and they can be seen and characteristically hovering. Other birds of prey include tawny owl. There's quite a lot of tawny owl, so you've got to obviously get up late at night normally to hear them, but they like the older trees along the side of the canal. Now, one of the birds that people most like to see but hardly ever see, and quite frustrating because people think, oh, we're supposed to see them on a river, is kingfishers. And you can go up and down the canal days and days and days, never see one, but they do exist. And every so often you get a tame one, or rather one that's probably greedier than, you know, its hunger is greater than its fear reflex. And they'll sit in a particular place and be quite easy to see for photographers. So, for instance, there's one or two that are around Paper Mill Lock, and not this winter, maybe last winter, a lot of photographers went to. At the moment, they seem to be quite easy to see around Beeley. There's sort of two or three that fly around the weir there. So, but anyway, if you do get to see one, brilliant. You just see a flash of blue flying by. If you get to sit one like that, see it like that, amazing. That's not my photograph. It's that called Simon Patient, who's, as the name suggests, much more patient than me. And I take a photo like that, I don't think. Right, so I mentioned Beeley. So next to the sort of other habitats, the other main habitat that can be seen on the navigation, which attracts different sorts of wildlife, is round about the weirs and rapids and so on at Beeley Mill. And the tidal nature of it means that you get varying amount of mud on view, and it's essentially brackish from up the estuary. And this will attract different birds. One of the best birds there is a grey wagtail. It doesn't deserve the name. It should have a much brighter name. And grey sounds a bit somber, but they are yellow underneath, grey on the back. And Beeley is the one regular place where they breed around the Malden district. The other bird you'll see quite often is little egrets. There's normally 2 or 3 paddling around there, and they breed at well, the biggest local egretry is at Chigborough Lakes, I don't know if you know Chigborough Lakes, there's Essex Wildlife Trust Preserve, just to the north of Heybridge. And if you go along Scraley Road, there's a sort of gate and you can look across, and if you're at the right time of year, you'll see lots of egrets there. Now, the birds I mentioned up till now are resident birds that are sort of seen all year round. Of course, some arrive for the summer only and come here to breed. The one on the left, the common tern, they don't actually breed on the navigation itself, but they like to go fishing there. They breed tend to breed in islands and lakes and so on. There are some that breed at Heybridge pits, but you quite often come the late spring, summer, see one just hawking along, flying along the canal, looking for fish to feed on. And then, of course, we have warblers. There's quite a lot of warblers that live around the navigation. One I picked out there is the garden warbler, and it's probably one of the rarest warblers we have in the Malden district. And typically, there may only be 2 or 3 pairs that we find, but the canal, the particular kind of trees and plants along the canal seem to be very attractive to them. So this year, for example, the only ones we've had singing throughout the year have been on the canal around Langford. Right, and then we have winter visitors. So I mentioned about the trees lining the canals. One of the key trees lining canals is alder. And alder is the favourite food of the yellow finch on the right, called the siskin. And they come from Europe, from Scandinavia. Some of them just come from East Anglia, in fact, the Brecks and so on. But they come and often seen in flocks in the tops of these alder trees. Now, the other thing there, which is a bit of a bad photograph, but it's my photograph, so no one else to blame. It's a goosander. These are fish-eating ducks. And on the Malden sections, we hardly ever see them. They do occasionally settle Ricketts Mere, but they are, I think, seen much more often on the Chelmsford end of the canal. And there's various lakes that they can be seen. There's some, they have regular favourite lakes. So Danbury Lakes is one, and also there's a lake, fishing lake at Alting, where there's often a flock. So if we see them on the Malden end, it's normally by accident. Maybe someone's chased them off somewhere else and we've sort of seen one sitting about. But they're quite large. I mean, the picture doesn't do them justice. They're quite large and dramatic fish-eating ducks from the north. And other winter visitors, I saw him one day. Obviously, he's going upstream, must be on his way to Chelmsford to deliver presents. There's all sorts on the canal. Right, let's go to mammals. Now, mammals are another thing where you can often go up and down the river, and the only mammals you see, apart from people, are dogs, because mammals tend to hide as well. But there are some around. And amongst the most frequently seen are probably grey squirrels, running around, very familiar. If you're later in the evening or earlier in the day, you might see a fox. But there's not that many mammals you normally see. This one who started being seen more and more is the muntjac. And muntjacs are interesting. They're sort of an introduced species. They escaped. I think they're from the Woburn estates. They began. They're actually the ones we get are Chinese origination. And to start with, there weren't that many, and people thought, oh, they're very cute and nice, and they are nice and cute, and they're relatively friendly, and they're the only deer you generally see around here. But as there are more and more of them, and they start munching people's bulbs in their gardens, then you know, popularity is beginning to swing the other way. But nevertheless, they're good to see, and we do see them around and about here. But others are much less welcome. And this is the mink, #1 bad guy in the area. They'll eat anything, but particularly things that will grow into cute things. So like duck eggs, ducklings, frogs, they're moorhen chicks, and they've got no natural predators. So you probably know the story that they were released or escaped from mink farms. These are the mink that we get are of American extraction, and they are prolific. A lot of time is being spent, and various people trying to catch them. historically, I don't know if any of you would know this. I mean, I certainly, it was before my time, but there's also another animal, coypu, that used to live in East Anglia. They used to live on the canals, and they're like the big rodents. I mean, if you've seen a capybara, it's about half-sized capybara, I suppose you'd say. And they caused a lot of damage to the seawalls, the canal embankments, and so on. So they were actually officially exterminated. But there were records from the Chelmer for molting, I think in the 70s or late 60s, certainly. But you know, they were previously. Unfortunately, mink are much more difficult to eradicate. Now, what a lot of people would like to see is actually otter. And I think people probably know, because you're quite familiar with the canal, that there are otter on the navigation here. They've come back. I think in the 80s, there were no wild otters in the whole of Essex, but they've gradually sort of crept back. Mostly though around here, what you'll see, if you look and know what to see, is otter spraints. And a friend called Russ, of our little local group, our first sort of knowledge that they were definitely around was finding some spraints, which is a polite word for sort of otter poo. And one key point about it makes you know it's otter, it's quite sweet smelling. I can't say I've ever put my nose close enough to say that, but other people I know who are more into these things have stuck up my nose. Oh yes, it's sweet smelling, as opposed to mink. And you can see it's a pile of fish bones. For a lot of people, that is all you'd see. Or at least when you see that, then you start beginning to see sort of ways that the otters may have got into the canal. And the thing is about our local otters is they're normally only seen very late at night. So around about the time this photo was taken, a few of us went out. We go to Ricketts Mere about 10 o'clock at night, really dark in summer, and just wait and wait and wait. And we saw them. We didn't see 2 or 3 otters there. Occasionally, though, they are seen elsewhere. They've been seen in the centre of Chelmsford, perhaps people know, by the cinema. You know, and normally they're seen because they're preoccupied doing something else. So I know someone who saw some fighting on the bank by Chelmer, fighting a pike, I think it was. And so people have seen them, and they do appear to be increasing. Occasionally there's dead ones found. The worry is the fishermen don't like. So not all fishermen, but there are, the worry is there are some fishermen who would sooner they weren't around. So apologies to, and you know, because I know there's lots of, well, my friends are fishermen who are quite happy to see them, but there's people who are. So I can understand why they spend the time at night. Occasionally, and I was really lucky earlier this year in Chidborough to come across an otter in broad daylight. Now, saying they're being preoccupied was one of the reasons to see them in daylight. This is a couple being very preoccupied with each other and not worried about me being on the bank. So I could take a photo of this dog otter and his intended that he's grasping around the neck. Right. Other mammals, well, classic mammal, it's a family of mammals for waterways, is bats. I mean, bats love moths, they love mayflies and all these things, and which all a river system will push up. There's a lot of different species, and around in our Malden area, of the 10 bats that are seen each year, regular bats in the whole of Essex, all are found in the Malden area, and particularly around the river. Now, this particular one is quite interesting. It's soprano pipistrelle. It favours watery habitats. The pipistrelles are the smallest bat, and this soprano pipistrelle, no one knew it existed about 30, 40 years ago because it's so similar to a normal common pipistrelle. But when people started using bat detectors, they realised that there was 2 distinct sounds coming from these pipistrelles, and actually managed to separate them and realised there's 2 species involved. When you look at them closer, the soprano pipistrelle is actually browner and furrier, which you can kind of make out on this photo. I will say this this photo is thanks, although I took it, it's thanks to the Essex Bat Group and a chap called Tim Sapsford, that they trap bats under license to find more about them. So this is one of several species of bats. I haven't got a photo of the most sort of typical water bat called a de Benton's bat, which actually specialises in flying low over the water, and then they live around the canal as well. They kind of, a bit like a hovercraft, they fly low over the water, picking up insects virtually from the surface. There have been a lot of bats in the past. They're sort of they're like old buildings. Around about Beeley Mill, at one point, there was a roost of about 1,000 pipistrelles. So there's quite large numbers, but difficult to see, unfortunately. But, and they're doing us all a favour, being there, helping to keep down the mosquito population. Okay, now we'll move away from mammals to dragonflies. Now, there's lots of other insect groups and so on that are sort of classic, but of the ones that are sort of good to see, easy to see, and bold and visual, probably butterflies and dragonflies are the main ones. And I picked dragonflies for this talk because they're interesting things. Every species of dragonfly or damselfly lays its eggs in water. So even if you see one in your garden or in a wood or whatever, it has been born out of a water system. And the species you get very much depends on the plants and the water quality of the particular environment. And Chelmer and Blackwater navigation is particularly good. There's a lot of different species of dragonflies and damselflies. Now, this is one of the most attractive ones that you probably see blinking away. It's called banded demoiselle. It's quite small, but it's got big black bands on its wings. And when it flies, they kind of blink at you and they sort of go on the edge of the canal. So you might well have seen this one as you're walking along. There's also more unusual ones. So now this is scarce chaser, and I was saying that the canal is particularly good. This was an extremely rare dragonfly in Essex. And the first proper site, well, that it was seen, found out, I think it was as recently as 2007, was around Elm Farm Park on the canal there. This is actually a female one, but the females are particularly distinctive. They've got this sort of like orange back with these black triangle marks down the down its back, down the segments of the back. It has since increased in numbers, and actually you can see on several different river systems. In fact, you see them quite a lot over Malden now, but the fact that they chose our canal to start with, I think is shows you that the water quality is pretty good. Another one, slightly smaller one, it's not as rare, it's very localized, quite hard to see, a thing called a white-legged damselfly. Trouble a lot to the damselflies, apart from the banded demoiselle I've shown earlier, a lot of them look pretty similar. They're all blue with different sort of black markings. This one is a bit more distinctive. It's got white legs, but it is quite local and unusual. And it's only seen in a few locations around Essex. And again, this is on our canal. This photo was taken by Langford. Right, challenging conditions. Well, this is what the wildlife has got to put up with in terms of weather systems and so forth. It has to put up with floods, huge amounts of water. You'll see people, and I'm sure you've seen them yourself, but canoeing of the weir at Beeley. It shows you how much water is pouring over there. The top left-hand picture, that they're actually canoeing over it. And at the bottom picture, you can sort of make out, I think, that the water is just pouring over the lock gates in the background. Now, the reason why this particularly changed, I mean, I'm amazed really that you see pictures like this and you're there, you can feel the force of the water, and yet you realize that all these dragonfly larvae are clinging on at the bottom, all the fish eggs and the fish, you know, little baby fish and everything, they're all kind of surviving under all these quite torrential conditions. And if we have a winter flood like this, I always think, are we going to see anything at all next year, or is it all going to be scoured out? But they do hang on, and I think it's they're clever things, really. Another challenging condition is snow and ice. If you think your environment is a water system, then the fact that it can freeze, you'd think it'd be pretty bothersome. And again, you know, sometimes when it's frozen, you wonder how it is that the life in the river, in the canal, carries on. But it's learned to adapt in general. I mean, there was a particularly bad spell. You remember the Beast from the East. Sadly, this was a cormorant down at Beeley that succumbed to the ice. It was all too much because they just couldn't fish properly. There was so much golden ice around. And of course, another challenge is invasive species. But fortunately, the heroes amongst the Canal Trust do their bit and help clear the pennywort away. But it is frustrating that this is all non-natural. It's just arrived, and through non-thinking people, it's just appeared. And I mean, in fact, Malden Wick, the pond at Malden Wick at the moment is covered in pennywort, which is unfortunate. There's other plants, plenty of invasive species to talk about Malden. They don't directly impinge on the canal. I mean, when last time, well, a couple of months ago, I suppose, I was walking on the canal looking across to Beely Abbey. There was a huge stretch of knotweed against one of the walls there. And I think, well, no one seemed to be doing anything about that, and that will spread. And you perhaps know knotweed is an ability to undermine foundations. So it's not healthy. And with Jan the other day, just on the canal, seen this Himalayan balsam, which is one of the most attractive plants, but it's beginning to grow here. And I don't know if people have been to elsewhere in the country where areas are completely covered in Himalayan balsam now. So anyway, things to look out for. So against all these challenges, I mean, unfortunately, we've got species that are disappearing. I mentioned two that we have still around the canal. And the canal, well, this year, can I say, for one of them, it's the only place really we've seen them in the area. For the other, there's one wood. But apart from this one wood, Hazley Wood, the only place we've heard nightingale has been down by the canal. Oh, yes. Yeah, they are elsewhere in Essex. I don't get out much. I think Neil, when I was talking to Neil the other day, saying you obviously don't get out much. I only tend to go 3 miles from Malden. So you're right. Danbury Common's a very good place for nightingale. Hazley Wood, but they are still there are still 1 or 2 pairs along the Canal Malden, and it was a reward, I think, for my own efforts of going out one day with a team to drag out some pennywort on a very blustery day. That actually we had there's a couple of nightingales singing down further upstream towards Chelmsford where we were. So they're holding on. They like particular habitats, particular sort of scrubs. But I think the main problem they've got is just they've got to migrate all the way to Central Africa and back. It's a very arduous journey, and they've got to make it back. And they seem to like breeding in sort of small colonies, like Danbury Common, as you say, or Hazley Wood. So if numbers start dropping, then they just begin to diminish and deplete. And numbers across the country are plummeting, which is a shame. And the other bird that, and as I say, the only, well, bar one I saw around the dump in Malton this year, the only ones that I know of around our area are along the canals, turtle doves. They're very sort of classic English species. Unfortunately, they've got very specific food requirements. They've also got to migrate down to Africa, and unfortunately, as they cross the Mediterranean, there are an awful lot of people try and shoot them. Every year, there's hundreds of thousands get shot. And so they are plummeting. There's various initiatives going on to try and preserve habitat for them, but it's worrying. I mean, just sort of 20 years ago, you'd see flocks around sort of Malden Hay Bridge, and on migration, you'd see them passing through. But sadly, they're noticeably declining. However, we have some new arrivals that we can look at to cheer us up a bit. One of them is sort of one of the most secretive birds around, a Chetty's warbler. You don't often see them. However, they're very noisy, and whether or not you realize it, you'll almost certainly have heard pairs along the canal. They're resident, unlike the rest of our warblers, and sort of things throughout the year. They've got quite a sort of staccato, chirpy song, and there's probably about every half mile or so along the canal now there's pairs singing. They first sort of started breeding in our area in Haybridge Pits, and they've kind of spread, but they're now the whole of sort of southeast of England has got thousands of these birds, and they're chirpy, they're nice, they kind of liven things up. They're not the most musical of birds, but they're probably one of the noisiest for their size. And then, I'm sure many of you would have noticed these, buzzards. So buzzards were persecuted heavily for their by gamekeepers and exterminated, not just from Essex, but from huge areas of England. But they're gradually making it back under their own steam. The first ones to breed locally here bred in 2014 in Hasty Wood, but the speed at which they're arriving is quite dramatic. And I should think there's many people in the room on the Zoom call who've seen these now. There's several pairs along the canal, no doubt breeding in some of the taller trees. And it just seems to work very well. We've got a very high rabbit population at the moment, which means there's a lot of rabbits also dying. And so that's the kind of one of their favorite quarries is dead rabbits. And also like things like earthworms and so on. And but they seem to be making real go of it and are, I say, a nice addition to our fauna. And this is the next one coming. Now, there's several kites been, well, I think the first local kite that was seen was in 2002 that I'm aware of, but now they're seen regularly and almost in a daily occurrence, and people have probably seen them flying around. I've seen them, certainly I've seen them myself sort of flying around the canal. They're not yet breeding to our knowledge in this immediate vicinity. They might be breeding Wickham Bishop's Way or Totham. I mean, there are that many that are seen, and it's only a matter of time, I think, before we'll get some kites breeding locally. Now, in contrast to the buzzards, kites have been intentionally reintroduced. They were a natural species here. In fact, I think the last pair in Essex is actually a pair that bred in Purley. But they were chased out, persecuted. A lot of people had free-range chickens running about. And what would be better food for a kite than someone who's got like, they purposely provided them with a range of chickens running about in the yard and just swoop down and get them. But I think the last ones were taken by egg collectors. But anyway, the population collapsed and reduced as just about 2 or 3 pairs in Wales, natural ones, one of which I saw in about the late 70s. But since then, they've been reintroduced very successfully, birds from Sweden and also from Spain, and they're spread. And they're attractive birds, nice birds. People in some parts of the country probably know that they feed them chicken legs and things in their garden, and a bit of a garden bird. And lastly of these introductions, or new arrivals, you may have begun to see Egyptian geese. I think everyone's familiar with the Canada geese, the geese, big geese with the white neckband, and the grey lags, sort of farmyard feral geese. Well, this is a newcomer. It's come from, I think initially they escaped from Holcombe Hall in Norfolk, and they gradually spread. And they look attractive. I mean, to me, they would be fine as long as you couldn't hear them, because they've got the most raucous, sort of asthmatic, awful, noisy call. So I personally don't like them. But anyway, they're spreading. I've seen them around Beeley. So, they're certainly in some of the parks now. So it's something you could, if you see something, if someone says, I've seen something really unusual, it's like a goose, but it isn't, and it's brightly coloured, it's normally an Egyptian goose. Right, and of the newcomers, there's also an awful lot of insects that are arriving, and this is very much climate change related. Of these, the most obvious are the damsel and dragonflies. So there was the first new one that arrived that wasn't in anyone's books. Everyone has, well, those who spend their money on these kind of things have books on dragonflies of Britain and so on. These are species that weren't even in the book. So when someone said there's a small red-eyed damselfly near Tillingham, everyone had to start looking up and phoning each other. What on earth are they talking about? So, so that was some years ago now. I think the late 80s. I just sort of sighed to Jan, is when Chris McGuigan came down, and we went down to Tillingham in great excitement. And the only one we actually saw, unfortunately, was a dead body in a spider's web. But they have now, those ones are now colonized sort of most of England. And in fact, they're commonly seen along the canal. In Malden, the pond at Malden Wick, opposite Morrison's, is a particularly good place. There's a lot of these small red-eyed damselfly. And then following on from that is one that's more particular to sort of river systems and canals and so on, the willow emerald. I can't remember offhand the date for that, but this arrived sometime about 2010 or so. About the first one I saw, Jan pointed out to me at Beeley. We heard they were down at Beeley by the weir, and they tend to, if you've got sort of willow trees particularly, they'll just hang from the branches of the willow trees. So whereas most damselflies will sit around in the grass on the floor, these things, if you see something hanging from like this, it's quite likely willow emerald. They're a lovely green colour, and the spots on the end of their wings are very pale, which is a sort of classic way of identifying them. There's more to come. There's a dragonfly, a really smart dragonfly called a blue-eyed hawker that's been spreading up. The first ones in Essex were in Hadley a few years ago. The first ones in Malden, I was pleased to photograph last year. Now, Limbourne Creek along the estuary, but the expectation is they'll soon be visible soon as well. And they're quite a large dragonfly, but blue and bright blue eyes. So very similar to a different species, migrant hawker, but the eyes are quite distinctive. So if I ever give this talk again, I might be able to include a blue-eyed hawker on the slideshow. Right, so impact of navigation on the estuary. So I spent all that time talking about typical canal species that can be seen pretty much the whole way from Malden way up to Chelmsford. But now I would like to sort of talk about how important the canal is, just for the last 5 minutes or so, in terms of the estuary itself. Because the whole of estuary is down to silt being brought down by the river system. This is a view. If you get a chance to go up the top of the Moot Hall when it's open on a sunny day, do it, because there's a great view across the estuary and beyond. Here you can see this from the Moot Hall. You can see the sort of the Blackwater, Chelmer, whatever, whichever you like to call it, snaking out past the prom with Northey Island across the way, and then it snakes out the back of the estuary. Now, what the river system is bringing down is very nutritious if you're a bird. So on the mud, this is sort of typical mud, you can see all these dots that are spread out. They're not that clear, but there are an awful lot of dots on there, which are different species of bird that like the mud, and they've got their different techniques. There's widgeon at the front, which sort of tend to eat the vegetation that's growing on the mud, and then there'll be wading birds, depending on what quarry they're after. They have different length bills. So the godwits probe deep into the mud, the curlews deep into the mud, a dunlin and ring plover just peck around on the surface. There's some particular species for which the Blackwater is internationally important, one of which is this, the Brent goose. It's a dark-bellied race of Brent goose that comes from Siberia. And we know that because in Siberia, where they breed, they put rings on them, coloured rings with numbers on, so you can specifically individually identify particular birds. And then there's the people who look for them when they come over here, and you can see those rings on them. So they come an awful long way to winter in the Blackwater. And the reason they do that is because Siberia all just freezes up. All the food resource and everything freezes up. Why they go back again is beyond me, because if they are in Siberia, they're chased by Arctic foxes, snowy owls, short-eared owls try and get them as well, try and get their eggs and their goslings. Whereas if they just sat around like the Canada geese and grey-lag geese do in the parks here, nothing would bother them. and they would just carry on. So anyway, amazing birds that they fly. But they're just beginning to come back now for the winter. This is a very successful family party. Sometimes they come back and there's no youngsters at all. There's been a bad year. But this year that I took this photo was a good year, and it's, in fact, it's the family party of 2 adults and 3 youngsters. So that's and they tend to keep together as a family party throughout the winter. But the other species that are particularly important in the Blackwater is the black-tailed godwit. There's again different races of godwit around the world, but these are Icelandic black-tailed godwits. They're coming from Iceland. They're very large proportion stay on the Blackwater. Some spend the whole winter here. Some use it as a staging post on their way to either the West Country or across the Channel into continental Europe and Spain and Portugal and so on. Very attractive birds in their summer plumage. And if you go to the prom, on the prom, and you see a big bird with a long beak, almost certainly it'd be a black-tailed godwit. When they're stood, they can look like other things, but when they fly, you see these black and white wing marks on this particularly good photo, which, as I say, they're not all my photos. A lot of the best ones are Simon Wood's, and this is one of his photos. There's another of his photos. An on bird that a lot of people don't realise you can see on the mud at Malden is avocet. In fact, quite often meet people who say, "Oh, I've just been to Minster and seen some avocets." Oh, interesting. I'd like to look through my telescope because I mean they're increasingly wintering on Blackwater. They used to winter further downstream, more towards Maylandsea, but year by year they come closer. They're quite often seen off the prom. And their presence and the presence of a couple of other species now, more towards the prom end of the estuary, tells me that I think the water quality is improving in the river system. So it doesn't have to be filtered out so much for the things to live that they feed on. But yeah, I mean, they're often not close. But if you see a sort of distant black and white thing, then they're probably avocets. And if you go every day, then sooner or later you'll find one right in front of you on the prom. And of course, the other reason for having the silt is we wouldn't have the mud run if we didn't have it. And yes, and people still turn out to do it. I think it's, unfortunately, COVID has put the damper on it, but hopefully it'll be starting up again next year. So I can watch everyone getting muddy. Right, well, that's pretty much it. I think I'm more or less to time, but I've got time for questions if you have any. Just say thank you. Just point out the photos. Some are mine, some are Simon Wood's, and there's a couple of Simon Patients. Now, there's a bit of a plug. I hope you don't mind, but it's just the timing of this talk. I wasn't sure when I was going to be asked to talk. It just so happens that it's taking place 4 or 5 days before the launch of a new book, where a lot of these photos actually are taken from. So I've got this book here, Wildlife of Malden, that is launching in the prom on Saturday, available from Malden bookshop on the High Street. And it's going to be launched in the hut in the park that they have at the moment. So if anyone would like a pre-publication offer, I do happen to have some here, if you would like a copy this evening. Otherwise, I'll put some information out, if that's okay, via the site, just to where you can get hold of them. At a point in time, I'll have a website you can buy them through. Right, so has anyone got any questions or anecdotes, maybe?
I've just got a reflection on something you said just now about the water quality of the estuary improving, when in fact it's not, it's deteriorating.
Oh.
Because the at Beeley, just below the weirs at Beeley, all of the sewage effluent from Chelmsford and Witham is discharged. And over the last number of years, with the expansion of Chelmsford getting larger and larger, and Witham, the amount of effluent discharged now on a continuous basis just below Beely Long Weir. It's opposite Beely Paul's house. You know where Beely Paul's house is. There's an outfall which you must know about on the edge of the golf course, and that is all effluent from Chelmsford and Witham, the volume of which increases year on year. And at low tide, that obviously goes through the estuary. At low tide, it could be 90+% effluent.
So has that happened just in recent years?
No. It's happened. It's happened since since the water company was formed at Langford, and it was discharged initially at Rushers Lock, because the water company used to take the Chelmer water from above Rushers Lock, and it was piped down to the reservoir at Langford in the water company reservoir, and the effluent was discharged there from the Chelmer, of course. And then when Hanningfield came along, Hanningfield Reservoir, and the Hanningfield station that fills Hanningfield Reservoir from Langford, they then had to, because the intake was at Langford, going to Hanningfield, they then had to bring the effluent below that level, so they took it down to Beely, and it joins up with the Witham effluent that comes over from Wickham Bishops. It joins up, the two effluents combine in a chamber next to the river, excuse me, and discharge it into the river there. The original plan was for it to be piped down to Haybridge Basin and to be discharged below where the canal comes into the river there. But due to financial issues, presumably, they cut it short and they discharged it. It was discharged there. But as I say, year on year, it increases in volume. So it is treated effluent. It is treated effluent, and it complies with the treated effluent standards. But it's not bacteriologically. They don't remove any of the bacteria. So coliform and E. coli levels are sky high.
So it could be that those conditions are more suitable for whatever the birds are feeding.
Exactly.
So it could not just seem. So from what you're saying, the actual canal itself, how's the water there affected? Because you're saying that it's below the canal that's getting pumped out. So how's the canal water quality changed over the years?
Well, the canal water quality stays pretty constant. It's purely down to rainfall and runoff from fields.
From the fields.
Nitrates and things like that come off field. Nowadays, they restrict farmers putting as much nitrate on, so you don't get as much nitrate coming into the rivers. But it doesn't have, as I say, it doesn't have any effluent in until it gets down to Beely. So it's quite reasonable water quality. I mean, obviously in winter you get the floods and all the the suspended matter comes down. But apart from that, the water quality is quite good. I speak.
Well, can I just come in here because there's three people with their hands up, and it'd be nice to be able to move on. I think we've got the point about the water quality, and it's interesting in your comments.
Okay, someone else like to make a point then? Or
we've got John Hannibal, Brian, and myself all with our hands up at the moment.
Sorry, who else are we?
Brian's next, then I think.
Brian.
Yeah, yes. Well, I think my question will be very short. To thank John for his marvelous exposition about the wildlife along the canal and the estuary. The question is, what's the cost of the book?
Oh. Well, the cost of the book after publication day is £17, but as a kind of pre-publication offer, it's 15 today. And if anyone has attended this call and wants to drop me an email, then I'm happy to honour the £15. It may take a little while to get it to you or whatever.
Very good, thank you.
Might be some postage involved.
And John, that will include be a signed copy of the pre-publication version, will it?
Well, if you'd like me to sign it, yes.
I'm sure that will increase its value hugely. John, I was going to make a comment following up what you reported me as having said to you previously, as well as ask a question. The comment was, you said, I told you need to get out more. I think I need to update that. You need to get out further. Because your comment about Himalayan balsam was interesting. The reason you've seen a small amount in the area you study is because there are vast amounts further up. If you go to the Essex Record Office, just downstream from there are massive, massive stands of Himalayan balsam. So it's on its way down, but so too is the rust that's been released that should kill it. But I think we'll have more down the bottom end before we get less. I was just going to ask, in terms of species moving, if you think what seems to be becoming a sort of permanent increase in interest and use of the navigation from pandemic onwards, with the hotspots like Paper Mill being so busy, which is very welcome, by the way. You know, a lot more people using the navigation, knowing it's there, using it for recreation, brilliant. But do you think that will have any lasting impact on wildlife and distribution and so on?
Yeah, it's a tricky one. I think certain specific species may be impacted a bit. I mean, but a lot of them won't. Like all the dragonflies and so on aren't really going to be that bothered by paddleboarders and so on. And I will observe that a lot of the hobbies that are taking place, like canoes and so on, are clean hobbies. They're not actually pumping stuff into the canal. So, so a lot of the dragonflies and a lot of the more unusual birds, like the nightingale and the turtle dove and garden warbler, are actually living in the trees and that are lining the canal, so they're not going to be put off. I think of the birds that actually living on the water, there's not that many species, and the moorhens and coots tend to survive whatever. But I think it'd be interesting to see what happens to the mammals. I mean, one mammal I didn't mention, mainly because I didn't get a decent photo, and that's mainly because they've been mostly eaten by the mink, water vole. Perhaps there's people on the call here who've seen them. I've seen them further downstream. I've seen some on the Borrow-dykes, on the seawall Borrow-dykes and so on, and there's some Heybridge pits. But they're kind of quite secretive things, and I imagine them being bothered by constant traffic. And it'd be interesting to see whether the otters, I mean, as I said, the otters around here are very nocturnal. Maybe they'll just stay being nocturnal because there won't, there's too much traffic on the canal to encourage them to feed during the day. But I think it's not so much for it. I mean, there's some things that are kind of, you see happen and you think, why? I mean, it's like there's a chap I saw with a dog, and his dog was swimming down the canal and he was picking up stones from the towpath and lobbing them in front of the dog into the water to try and encourage the dog just to keep swimming down. Now, I thought a dog swimming down the canal would be far more scary for a lot of the wildlife than someone on a paddleboard. But anyway, we'll
thanks for that. And I noticed, I don't know whether you do, that Paul would like to ask a question. He can't find the raise hand emoji, but Paul Younger would like to ask a question. So can we follow on with Paul, please? You need to unmute yourself, Paul. You have done.
Thanks very much, Neil. Good to hear that canoeing is considered to be one of those clean sports. But I do have a question, and it was sent to me by somebody, one of the canoeists who does use Beely, and he said there's a note there at the moment saying that there's dragonflies nesting. Do dragonflies nest, and should there be a notice at Beely saying stay away from this portage because of nesting dragonflies?
Well, dragonflies do they lay eggs, but as I sort of explained, they normally lay them underwater. Quite often they'll lay them on a bit of vegetation that's sticking up from the water, and they'll dip down and lay on the submerged parts of that vegetation. Now, I mean, if someone is concerned about dragonflies, it's great. I think we should all be concerned about this wildlife. And I wouldn't, it's not something that immediately struck me as being a problem. I mean, it's difficult. One of the things about the way the canal seems to be set up is from a portage point of view, everyone uses what seem to be quite well designed bits, sections by the lock gates where you go up and down with your canoe, which means people don't go in all the sort of intervening areas. So I'd have thought the actual canoe part of that wouldn't be a problem. What's more of a problem, I would say, is people who have, just a bit of a bugbear. Someone who has a dog, for instance, who just ferrets along the whole length instead of going on the towpath, sort of in a sort of a regular way, will just ferret about. Maybe it's picking up otter scents or mink scents or whatever, and going along the very edge of the water. And then again, I mean, if fishermen are on sort of predefined patches, then that's probably okay because you've got gaps between them. But if people just kind of start fishing wherever, then that could be a problem. So, I mean, it's certainly a challenge when you've got so many people wanting to enjoy the same stretch of water at the same time for different purposes. It's kind of, how do you strike a balance? I mean, it's hard. Ideally, you'd have two canals, one for people and one for the wildlife.
Absolutely. But I mean, if anybody knows a reason why we shouldn't be using it because there's a particular animal or insect, rare insect or something at a particular point, then if we know, we can let people know. But if it's a concerned member of the public who might have put something there, then that might be something different. I don't know who wants to do that.
Sorry, very quickly, whereabouts was it?
Beeley. There's a portage at Beeley, apparently.
Oh, I might have a look and just try and see if I can understand what's going on there.
Okay.
Sounds to me like it might be a fake news situation that's being picked up.
I mean, it's a bit like there's people, all this notice about whether or not you should feed ducks and so on. I mean, people are best of intentions, people are putting signs up all over the place, and it's a bit difficult to know what to do. I mean, personally, I'm not aware. I mean, well, of all the dragonfly species that I know of, they're spread out quite well along that bit of canal. So I can't think there's anything that's got a particular spot. If you used to say grey wagtails nesting there, I'd say to you, well, there's only one grey wagtail pair nesting in the whole of the area. So, I mean, fortunately, they're not nesting where you're putting your canoes. But if they were, then that would be a good reason for me to why you'd want to cordon it off, because you wouldn't want to disturb them.
Well,
John, I'm concerned you might be missing out on a new species here. The Beeley Portage Point dragonfly is nesting just under the boards there, and you might be the first person to identify this. I'm sorry. Let's get focused. The time's moving on. We've had a chance for questions. Is there anybody else who wants to ask a question? I'm just doing this because I can't see that William's doing anything now. I'm not suggesting he's not doing anything, by the way. I just don't know whether he's chairing or not. Any more questions? No, in that case, I'm pleased, John, to be able to sort of formally propose a vote of thanks to you for a fascinating talk this evening, brilliantly illustrated, lots of fascinating facts within it, embroidered into it, and local, locally focused as well. So can we all either show our emoji thing, our reaction thing on our Zoom screen, if we know where that is, or just physically clap, please? So thank you, John, very much indeed.